Hi, everyone. Welcome to our inaugural episode of Public History with Jake and Justin. I'm Jake, and this is Justin.
Hello. Together, we are your co hosts for this new show where we're going to be talking about something Jake and I both love a lot, and that is history, but also public history. Jake and I both have experience working at historic sites, museums, Civil War battlefields, and are excited to talk not just about history, but how people interact with history at those sites.
So, we're going to be hosting a variety of different kinds of episodes for you. We'll be interviewing public historians who work at our nation's historic sites, parks, and museums about the art and practice of talking history out there in the real world. What does public history mean exactly?
Without trying to be super cheesy, public history is defined by the National Council on Public History as history beyond the walls of the traditional classroom, including the myriad of ways history is consumed by the general public.
And who exactly are these public historians? Well, NCPH also has a definition for that. We call ourselves historical consultants, museum professionals, government historians, archivists, oral historians, cultural resource managers, curators, film and media producers, historical interpreters, historic preservationists, policy advisors, local historians, and community activists, among many other job descriptions.
So, all of those folks, we will be talking to about the products they create museum exhibits, the walking tours, documentaries, films, television shows, plays, and really any medium that brings history into the public. So, I think with that, Jake, I'm excited to talk about the first thing we're going to tackle, which is what?
And we are going to be focusing our first episode on a recent piece of television focused on American history. Apple TV Plus has inserted itself as the place for historical drama in early 2024. Justin and I did a YouTube series about Masters of the Air, which was a historical miniseries on Apple TV Plus that aired in early 2024, focused on the World War II era. And now Apple TV Plus has given us another series, and this is called Manhunt. It's based on James Swanson's book about the Lincoln assassination and the hunt for John Wilkes Booth. So, in this episode, we are going to talk about the first two episodes of the drama and share many of our facial hair related hot takes and opinions on this series. We're also going to talk a little bit about the history that we see interpreted in this series as well. So, what exactly is Manhunt? The book. It is a James Swanson thriller. It is a nonfiction book, although it has some fictional elements that I always it kind of drives me a little bit crazy when it's like, oh yeah, James Swanson's book Manhunt. It's like this great historical narrative, and then I'm like, but how does he know exactly what John Wilkes Booth was thinking at exact specific moments in that book? It always drives me a little bit crazy. Nevertheless, one of my favorite books, and it is a riveting read. And as we are going to discuss, also makes for some fairly decent television as well. But Justin, what do you have to say about Manhunt?
Well, I think this is one thing, taking kind of a thousand-foot approach on it. This is one of those public history moments that I think we need to talk about, right? And as we talk about this show, we have to ask ourselves, what are the things that TV shows like this owe to the history it portrays? How do you go about when you create the show? Finding the fine line between telling a great story but also staying true to the historical fact. Sometimes the historical fact is really good, but you need to take some thematic liberties to make it more exciting, to make it something you can watch. And I think this show is a great thing to start off with, about something that some scenes they do very, very well, and in some scenes you kind of scratch your head and you think, okay, this is, what the heck is this? And I'm sure we'll kind of cover that. So without further ado, I guess let's start talking about those scenes, Jake, with episode 1 and 2. And where does this start? How does Manhunt start? What is the setting that we are in as we kind of get zoomed into the series?
Yeah, so we're going to do kind of a brief synopsis of the first two episodes before we really dive into some of the history behind it and some of our thoughts about it as well. But Manhunt opens up in the immediate aftermath of Appomattox Courthouse. It's April 1865. The United States Army has just defeated Robert E. Lee, and Robert E. Lee has surrendered his Confederate Army. That comes just a little less than a week after the Confederate capital at Richmond is surrendered to U.S. forces as well. So this is a time of celebration, victory in the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., and that is where a lot of this show is going to take place. we're also introduced to one of the main characters, kind of the antagonist of this story, and that is John Wilkes Booth. And that is played by actor Anthony Boyle, who, as part of the Apple TV Plus historical drama era that we are seeing right now, Anthony Boyle also played Navigator Harry Crosby in the Masters of the Air series. So it's a little bit jarring to see him jump out of playing this
Yes.
jovial, kind of goofy guy who's always airsick to playing one of the great all-time villains of American history. A little bit jarring, but I think that we'll talk about this a little bit more. I think Boyle does a pretty good job. I know Justin has some thoughts about that. Um, we also get to see a little bit of the Surratt boarding house and some of the other conspirators that are going to be involved in this. The show does a very good job of centering the fact that this is a bigger plot than just killing Abraham Lincoln. This is a plot to decapitate the federal government in one fell swoop. And that is made clear in these first two episodes, just the size and scope, and trying to understand how big this conspiracy is. We also get a glimpse at one of those conspirators, a gentleman, basically a boy named Lewis Powell, who is not the brightest bulb out there, asking before he goes in to try to assassinate William Seward, the Secretary of State, asking Secretary of State which state. I did have a chuckle at that because that is true to the nature of Lewis Powell, the historical figure,
Yeah.
and it shows a little bit about this team that Booth is working with, right, Justin?
Yeah, I mean, it's the B team, right? Like this is not your cast of characters that I think that you would want to pick out. I mean, you have Powell, you have George. I can never say his last name. How do you say Azeroth?
Azeroth, yep.
Azeroth. Okay, good. I said it right. And him just like walking through with like a hey, can I fix your carriage? No, okay, can I fix your carriage? And it's just like this weird reminder that Booth is the head, and what he will do will be successful. But literally every other thing about this assassination fails. It's a terrible, terrible fact that the only thing that probably was the most important thing that couldn't fail did, and that is the assassination of Lincoln. So, but yeah, I mean, it goes right into with Powell walking straight in the front door and failing to kill Secretary of State William Seward, who is laying prostrate in his bed and cannot defend himself, and yet Powell still fails to finish the job. Once again, showing you the I guess competency of this team that Booth assembled is not the most not the A team. I'll put it that way. This is
Yeah.
not even the JV team. This is like the freshman team, I guess, if anything like
Yep.
that.
So
But
I did think that they did an interesting job of showing the assassination attempt on Seward. Instead of following Powell in, they kind of stick with David Harold, who's another of the conspirators who's going to spend a lot of time with Booth later on. Um, and I think sticking with Harold, it makes it interesting. You see the whole thing from the outside as it develops, as Powell fails to fire his pistol, which he says he's better with a gun than he is with a knife. And the gun jams almost immediately, and he's in there swinging it and then stabbing William Seward, and there's yells of murder, murder out the window, which is ultimately what forces David Harold to kind of run and escape and leave Lewis Powell to his own devices. Just going to come back to bite him. Um, but then we get to meet our protagonist of this story, and that is Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, played by Tobias Menzies. Uh, and of course, from the first time I saw this trailer, and what led me to have extremely low expectations about Manhunt as a series, was the fact that Edwin Stanton, famously bearded. Literally, I looked this up on Library of Congress, went to the photographs from the Civil War era, and just plugged in Edwin Stanton. And literally every photograph in that collection, he has a very large, bushy beard. Um, but we do not see Stanton with a beard in this show. Nevertheless, withholding judgment because I do enjoy his acting. And so I think that it actually kind of overcomes. After a while, I stopped noticing the fact that he doesn't have the beard. I do love this line we get from Stanton's wife, which is I think really true to the nature of Edwin Stanton, which is, "Have you ever met a problem you couldn't delegate?" And I think that is just a brilliant commentary on Stanton's character, as who he was as a politician, as a lawyer, as a Secretary of War, as a cabinet member to Abraham Lincoln. But now we enter Stanton as crime scene investigator.
And it's funny because I was discussing with Jake beforehand of maybe it's because I watched, my parents watched CSI as a kid. Every in NYPD, whatever show that is on ABC, CBS, or whatever is always some sort of law enforcement show. And every single opening of every episode is the same thing, where there's a body on the ground, and then there's the cool detective walking in with his coffee or her coffee and just being like, "Yep, what's going on," makes a wisecrack here or there, and then, oh my gosh, the body, that kind of stuff. Kind of get that here. It's the 1860s version of that, of Edwin Stanton being the crime scene investigator. The last thing I guess I was waiting for was him to put on some sunglasses at the end and like a Who guitar riff just starting out of nowhere, and you're like, we'll find him. And then you just, cut to scene, cut to the intro theme. So, but yeah, I mean, I think they do a pretty good job. You see the result of the attacks with Stewart and him being bloody on his bed too. So I don't know. And going back to what you said about the have you ever met a problem that you couldn't delegate? It's like they hired a historian. The historian wrote a big thing on who Edwin Stanton was, and basically just said, "Okay, cool. We're just going to create a quote that describes this," even though that quote probably his wife never said to him. Like you said, Jake, it's a fantastic thing to be like, yeah, no, that is actually historically right. Like, yeah, it wasn't actually said, but he was in the War Department. You start to see that, right? You start to see the first of the flashbacks, which is them sitting around the telegraph office and waiting for news from the front, waiting for news from Appomattox. And that is a place that both Lincoln and Stanton would have been there almost every single day waiting for news from the front lines, especially around different events and different campaigns. So with that, I think he does a great job of showing his asthma, and what's eventually, spoiler alert, going to kill Edwin Stanton is the fact that you can make the argument, worked himself to death. He will take up the fight. And this is the kind of beginning, I think, of him working himself to death. Not that the war didn't do that. But you always talk about presidents when they go in the office, when they come out of office, the differences in ages and how it ages them. For Stanton, this is something I think you could kind of say is caused by the stress of the war. And I'd have to go more research and see if this was something that ailed him previously to that. But as soon as the word of Lee's surrender reaches, the whole room goes crazy and he suffers an asthma attack. And that progression is what will end Stanton's life there. But I thought the scene was great. But Jake, I think I'll let you answer this. The bar is very high. Daniel Day-Lewis, the bar for portraying Lincoln was very high. And no matter who it was, I think that they were going to fail it. But how, in your kind of, I don't know, what did you think of the portrayal?
Yeah, I think there are many actors that have played Lincoln. I think Daniel Day Lewis is by far the best, and that's something we'll probably discuss quite a bit through these kind of recaps of Manhunt. Is just how this show compares and contrasts with the 2012 Lincoln film, in part because it is dealing with some of the same themes and issues in the same time period, roughly in early 1865. Um, but it seems as though the actor playing Lincoln listened to Daniel Day Lewis play Lincoln and then was just riffing on that. He maybe heard, yes, he had kind of a high pitched Midwestern accent, and he ran with it. Boy, did he run with it. It it's a little nails on a chalkboard. But there's times through this, not just in these two episodes, but we see future flashbacks as well, where there are times where I'm like, wow, he is literally channeling the cadence that Daniel Day Lewis had. I feel like they use that portrayal of Lincoln as really the basis for this Lincoln in Manhunt. Um, in some cases for good, in other cases, with especially with the voice, not so much. I did think in this flashback that was an interesting perspective that I hadn't seen on film before. It was not included in Lincoln, but interesting perspective of seeing President Lincoln, Edwin Stanton, and the War Department on the day of the Appomattox surrender, just giving kind of a portrayal of that scene and what it would have been like to be there. So that was an interesting perspective. We also get lots of references to extremism in the Confederacy, and the fact that Southern secessionists amongst these armies and among the politicians who were forced to flee Richmond and people kind of pro Confederate scattered all over the countryside, there is still a lot of anger, frustration, extremism in regards to emancipation and the end of slavery. And that is a source of discussion and driver of this plot, both in terms of Manhunt and in terms of John Wilkes Booth, the plot that is at the center of this show. Um, and they really do center that story. We see it quite a bit, including in the Star Saloon, which is where we see John Wilkes Booth having a drink. I love a good 19th century tavern and bar scene, so this was nice and historic. This really did happen with John Wilkes Booth having a drink there, right next door to Ford's Theater. We see Booth's extremism on display. It's always on display when we see him on screen. He almost acts his way through being an extremist, being a Southerner. Even though he's a Marylander, he's born and grows up north of Baltimore. Um, he makes s- the Southern identity key to his identity, and the Confederacy is key to his identity. And because it's dying in April of 1865, he is angry, frustrated, and that extremism is on full display. Um, and I think it is interesting that they positioned Booth as acting in as kind of acting in the assassination to become a legend, in the way that his brothers are more famous actors than he is. He wants to make his own legacy, and he wants to be famous. He loves fame, he loves its pursuit, and that really is the driver of the Booth character in Manhunt, as it was uh, quite a bit in reality as well. Um, and we see Booth going into Ford's Theater. We know what's going to happen. We know that he's going to strike. What the detail that I loved in here that they included was that he knows the play. He knows Our American Cousin. He knows the lines. He knows when the crowd is going to burst into laughter when that last line of the scene is delivered. And he knows he can use that to cover his approach, and knowing that the stage will be clear. So he has an escape route as well. And then we
And I
see the
think that
moment. Oh,
Yeah,
go ahead,
sorry, I don't
Justin.
mean to jump on you. I think that that's something that once again he is the only competent person that's doing this evening, right? Like that is actually very well thought out and and he's a smart guy for whatever you want to call John Wilkes Booth. He's a smart guy and he understands that kind of moment is when he needs to pounce and waiting for and some accounts that I've read too, there was the biggest laugh of the play, right? He's waiting for this joke. It's kind of, I think it's like a raunchy joke too.
Yeah.
That he waits for because it garners the biggest laugh. Does every single night. He knows what he's doing. He's a professional actor, and I think that that was a fantastic way to kind of show that complexity in there. Not complexity, but show that he's not dumb. I guess.
Yep. Yep. So we see just pure mayhem as Booth commits the act, as he commits the murder, assassinates the president. There's a scuffle in the box. He uses his knife. There's an army officer in the adjacent booth that had traveled there with the president and his wife. We see Booth scream and jump to the stage. He gets caught and falls to the stage. He breaks his leg. He gets up, stumbles to his feet, and yells out the famous line "Sic Semper Tyrannis," and shuffles off stage, makes his escape. We see the actors backstage and kind of some of the stage crew that were involved in this situation, involved that night in ways that are very mundane, holding a door, holding a horse. That is going to put them at the center of this drama. But Booth ultimately makes his escape, gets to the Navy Yard Bridge, crosses the Anacostia River into southern Maryland, and heads out there to a hotbed of Confederate support. So, Justin, you have a little bit of commentary here you want to make
Well,
about Booth?
yeah, and Jake, we were talking before the episode of Booth is what type of actor in the 1860s? Is he an A-lister, B-lister, C-lister? And I proposed initially that okay, he's like a C-list actor, and I think as the series continues, you kind of see he is not an A-lister based off of the relations with his brother. His brother, you could say, for all intents and purposes, was one of the most famous actors in America at this time. So he is the younger brother of the most famous actor. So he himself is up there in fame. But Jake and I were kind of kicking ideas back and forth, and maybe you guys can think about it in the comments or as you're listening too. What is the current equivalent to that? Taking politics aside, who is the fame level of this type of person who would assassinate the president? And Jake, you had a funny, it, you had a funny kind of answer to that, which is who?
Yeah, so I was like, okay, famous acting siblings, and first thing that came to mind is like the Franco family. So it's like Dave Franco has assassinated the president.
Dave Franco.
It's the
Uh,
equivalent. It's the equivalent of like. I mean, I think it's actually a fair thing to think about because that's what they dealt with. I mean, this is absurd. Nothing, no assassination had happened in American history to this point. And the fact that it was a famous, well-known actor that committed the act is like, I mean, mind blowing. You get that from Stanton, and it's a shock, And then Stanton, as he's brought to comes to Ford's Theater, learns of the assassination. He goes to the Peterson House, which is across the street from Ford's Theater. It's the boarding house where Lincoln is going to be brought. It's where his last hours are going to be spent. And he is going to go in there and spend the last hours with Lincoln. And one of these things, we continue to hear about in the Peterson house. Robert Lincoln refers to this as being about emancipation and it coming too soon. There is constant conversation about the role that slavery, emancipation, and Southern extremism plays into the assassination, into this plot. We are going to continue to hear about this topic throughout the rest of the series, which I think is very well done on the part of the filmmakers. Um, One thing that this episode really reminds me of, something that is comparable to something we've all lived through. Well, not anymore. I say we did not all live through this.
right,
There's
right.
plenty of people now that did not live through this experience. But it does remind me of 9/11, September 11th attacks, and with the government and the realization that these hijacked planes were aiming to decapitate the government and Wall Street, targeting the Capitol, the White House, New York financial district. This is the level of plot that is unwinding itself on the night of April 14th, 1865, and in real time, the government officials, the army are trying to grasp what is happening, and it makes this a moment in American history that is there's only a few other moments like this that have been in our history. You think of 9/11 or Pearl Harbor, these moments that where there's a lot of like, what's going on? What do we do? How do we respond to this?
And I
Um,
think that it's also, I mean, like you said too about the decapitation of the government. I don't know if Booth knew this, but it was a near miss because Grant, this is us, Grant and Edwin Stanton. You see this later on in the series. Were invited to the theater that night with Lincoln. So there was a chance that they would have been the ones sitting in the booth beside them. Now I don't know if, once again, Booth knew that his goal was to kill Lincoln. He succeeds. Don't know if Grant or Stanton being there would have changed the outcome. But yeah, I mean, a near miss of they are trying to decapitate the entire government. Seward is the Secretary of State. Azeroth was tasked to kill who? Jake, was it Stanton or
no, he's tasked with killing the
Oh,
vice
sorry,
president,
John. Yeah, the vice
Andrew
president. Yeah,
Johnson.
correct. Because you see that, right? And you see it later on in the episode where the vice president will say, hey, the guy was arrested here who was tasked to see me later on last night. Right? And I don't know. I think that's the other fascinating thing that you start to see in this is people start looking, and we'll cover this in later episodes, but people start looking to Andrew Johnson and his kind of yeah. Sorry, did I just say the president? Andrew Jackson or Johnson? Johnson. Good lord, man, it's been a long day. Anyway, yeah. So they start to see it. Is he culpable in this? He is a Southerner. He comes from the South. What is his role in this? He's the only one who doesn't have an actual assassination attempt on him. So it's interesting to kind of see that. But yeah, you're right. I think the 9/11 comparison is great because it also spreads as close to real time as it possibly can. Telegraphs throughout the country are going to start relaying this news pretty quickly. So while you can't visually see it, Americans are waking up the next day with the news, or even that. Well, I guess it happens at night. So yeah, they're waking up with the next day with the news. President is dead, and that's starting to filter by word of mouth through towns throughout the entire country. So every American will have that kind of experience on where was I when I got word that Lincoln was assassinated.
So then we see, as we continue on, we see the scenes in the Peterson house where we have Lincoln's death recorded at 7:22 in the morning of April 15th. We get the famous, one of the two famous lines that Stanton was said to have uttered upon the death of the president. In the series, we see now he belongs to the Angels. The other version, which is the one that I prefer, I think it's a little bit more to Stanton and Lincoln's relationship. That now he belongs to the ages. Um, but that's the line they went with Angels. So much more conversation goes on about Reconstruction and in the aftermath of Lincoln's death in this show, talking about the kind of legacy of the Lincoln presidency, about this being what he's working on in the days leading up to his death. And then we jump right to seeing some really powerful scenes as Lincoln's body is brought out of the Peterson house and Washington's Black community is gathered around, as well as Black soldiers, to see the president who brought emancipation to the United States in the midst of this bloody Civil War, and also allowed Black soldiers to go out and join the fight as well. Um, it's a pretty powerful scene and a reminder of what this was all about and what ultimately is at the heart of this assassination. Why John Wilkes Booth did what he did is scenes just like this. The fact that emancipation and the arming of Black men in the Union Army has come to pass by 1865. I think there's also this is a good reminder, just again, I know I mentioned this a little bit before, but there's a lack of context for any presidential assassination previously in American history. So this is an act that is shocking. And at the end of this bloody Civil War, in which everybody was in Washington, maybe not everybody, a lot of the people, especially in the capital, but in the North, were very excited about the war coming to its conclusion. We also send Stanton into Ford's Theater. He goes into the crime scene, puts back on the sunglasses, and goes back into detective crime scene investigator mode. He goes into the theater and tells a reporter that we see throughout this series, who's kind of an agent for the War Department as well. I think one of the lines that made me actually audibly laugh when he said it, get Brady, tell him to photograph this theater like a battlefield. I was like,
I'm telling you, that's the perfect time for a cutscene. That's the perfect, like, insert riff, and then you're gonna flash to something else, like any modern crime scene drama is. Or like he's saying that as he takes a whiff of a cigarette, and it's just that's what he's doing.
yep. Then we flash to Booth, and so we're going to have lots of conversation throughout this episode and throughout the series about this concept of like how can a democracy survive not only a bloody civil war but also an attempted coup and a terrorist strike essentially at the heart of government. And Booth says that he quote always reads his reviews when he's reading an editorial story about the assassination that he had committed the night before or in the days before, and refers to himself as wanting to be a symbol of the cause, being the cause of white supremacy, of the Confederacy as well. And then we're going to see quite a bit at the home of Dr. Mudd. Reminder here that slavery ended in Maryland in November of 1864. They don't really talk about that in the series in episode one. They're going to see it again in episode. We'll see it in episode two. But we're also going to have a lot of conversation, and the series is really going to be driven on the idea of Booth's connections to the Confederate Secret Service, which does exist, did go through Southern Maryland, through the same area they're going to refer to as the line that goes across the Potomac River and into Virginia through Southern Maryland. It does exist, the Confederate service there, and Booth has deep ties to that. And this is going to be a key part of the series moving forward is Just how much did the Confederate government know about this assassination plan? Were they involved? Who funded it? And this is going to be the driver of things moving out of episode one and through the rest of the series. And we're also going to see Stanton introduce the concept of figuring out who's responsible for this. And does that mean that another war is starting? And I would say, as we're going to talk more about the fact that the Civil War, though it comes to an end at Appomattox and with the subsequent surrenders of other field armies, the violence never stops. And Reconstruction is just going to pick up with violence of a different sort of asymmetric warfare. And Stanton is kind of alluding to that at the end of episode one. Before we jump into episode two, Justin, do you have any thoughts on episode one that we want to address right away before we roll into episode two?
No, I think we covered most of it. I think it's funny because it's something that all of us know the history of it, or all of us at least know the story. John Wilkes Booth shoots Lincoln and all that kind of stuff. And this is, correct me if I'm wrong, Jake, one of the first times it's been addressed on film. I mean, even you know, I can't really think of another time that I've seen it with my eyes and kind of played it out this way. So I think that is something. I mean, that is being able to see him shoot, jump down, see the six for Tyrannus and run off the back and something is one of those scenes that, it's such a seminal moment in American history. And I think it's one of the first times it's been done well on screen. So I don't know. That's was my initial thought on episode one. I know we're going to talk kind of the series in general in the future too, but yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking is, this is the first time I'm physically seeing this. I've read about this for so long. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I still don't know. Probably, I still need to watch it a couple more times to really, I think, get a sense of how I feel about that type of, or how I feel about it, and what that kind of the emotions it brings up into me.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's certainly in recent film or television, we have not seen the Lincoln assassination played out. And I think that showing it, and especially the way they do, the way they frame it, and frame Booth's ideology and the reason that he acts the way that he does and commits the act, I think is getting to some important conversations in the field of Civil War history, especially around the end of the conflict and Reconstruction, that we will be discussing in more depth as we proceed forward. Let's jump into episode two. I have my thoughts on the opening sequence that we see for the first time in the second episode. I thought the opening, the credits with all the historical photography, the music, I think that is brilliantly done. Honestly, like one of the best opening sequences I've seen in a long time, and one that I usually am a skip intro guy. This is one that I'm like, this is good. I'm gonna sit down. I'm gonna watch this. Um, and we get to see in episode two, we get to meet Lafayette Baker, key to this story, agent with the War Department, kind of a scandalous guy himself, and being played by, of all people, Patton Oswald, um, who I think does a really good job of playing this character.
And it's yeah, and I think that was the other thing, right? That added to the low expectations of, Patton Oswalt to me is he's the nerd's nerd, right? Like he's the guy that I remember from Parks and Rec who, correct me if I'm wrong, like just riffs all like the scene in Parks and Rec of him riffing for a filibuster about Star Wars was a scene that was an actual just riff. They just said, "Hey, Patton, like go out there and do it." So like it's hard for me. It's really really hard, and it's nothing on Patton Oswalt. It's just I just cannot separate the art from the artist here, and it's just very hard to do. But hey, he's acting his butt off. I enjoy it. I think maybe this might change my perception of how I view him as an actor. But yeah, I think I don't know. I it brings me joy. How about that? It brings me joy to watch it as him as Lafayette Baker.
So we get to bring down the mood a little bit. We see kind of some reminders of Edwin Stanton's own losses during the war. He loses a son during the conflict, infant son. Reminder as well that the that Stanton's wife that we see, Ellen, in this series is Stanton's second wife. His first wife passes away before the Civil War. That becomes a plot point a little bit later on in the series. And we are finally really introduced to Mary Surratt. And our old pal from episode one, the always bright Lewis Powell, returning while investigators are there talking to Mary Surratt. This is all too true,
Yeah.
and this is in Swanson's book. They kind of it's pretty close to the portrayal that we see in the series. What we read in Swanson's book, the fact that he comes in, and she tries to pretend that she doesn't know who he is. He's not picking up on that. He doesn't realize that the investigators are there. Then he tries, when he realizes it, he tries to say he's just digging a ditch. They're like, "Why are you digging a ditch in the middle of the night?" And hilarity
Reminder.
ensues, and they all get arrested.
Yeah, reminder, Jake. This is the B team. This is the B team. And the historical fact about this too is kind of funny. Is this is not the first time he has been captured or quote unquote arrested. Lewis Powell also fights at Gettysburg with the Florida unit and is captured, I think, on the second day of Gettysburg, and then I think escapes from captivity. And generally, just one of those little things to think about too. And Jake and I are NASCAR fans. We're probably going to make a lot of references to NASCAR. Um, in this scene, the guy who's living at the Surratt boarding house, he's a red haired guy. Um, I'm sorry, but he just looks like Tyler Reddick. It is Tyler Reddick. Tyler Reddick is in the 1860s, staying at the Surratt boarding house, working for the War Department. Um, yeah, I don't know, Jake. I know you would appreciate that as a NASCAR guy as well
Yeah,
as me. But that's just who I think of
you
every
can't
single time I think I see that guy.
you can't unsee it. You can't
I
unsee it
cannot.
for sure. So we get to spend some time with Vice President Andrew Johnson in episode two. I have to say, very well cast. I think of all of the characters in this, other than maybe Anthony Boyle as John Wilkes Booth, Vice President Andrew Johnson is cast extremely well. I think the actor does a very good job there. Um, Super nonplussed by an attempt on his life that may have taken place. That there's an assassin waiting for him downstairs. That the only reason he didn't go upstairs and kill the vice president, is because he quote unquote lost his nerve, and had lots of alcohol. Um, we also get immediate tension between Johnson and Stanton. It is immediately clear, not friends. And This is going to be a source of tension throughout. We're going to see this in future episodes as well. We also get some flashbacks here to and an introduction to John Surratt, Mary Surratt's son, who is a member of the Confederate Secret Service operating in Southern Maryland. Um, plays a number of roles during the course of the Civil War, and is going to be kind of a side character to the whole hunt for John Wilkes Booth as well. And we also get a vivid picture of Booth as an extremist, racist hardliner in his scenes with Mary, the formerly enslaved person of the Mudd family, who is still living there in the aftermath of emancipation, still working in the Mudd household. And the scenes with Mary and Booth are very uncomfortable to watch. I think filmmakers did a good job of showing Booth's true nature in those scenes, and also we get to see um, Mary through some flashbacks as well, scenes in Pennsylvania in the years leading up to the Civil War, and the reality of post Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Realities in the years leading up to the American Civil War. So one of the main reasons that the conflict is going to be fought, is the Fugitive Slave Act in the coming of the Civil War in the 1850s.
Yeah, and I think that's out of all the scenes kind of in the first couple episodes, we talked about the Booth assassination, actually seeing it out. But I mean, memorably, the scenes for showing the Fugitive Slave Act have stuck with me. That's what I've kept thinking about in these first couple episodes as we talk about it. It's like, okay, what scenes do I want to talk about? It keeps going back to that because once again, never really seen it on screen. Never really, you read about it, you say, oh, that's terrible. But to actually physically see it, to hear the screams, to hear the screams of a girl like that being taken back into slavery is heartbreaking. And
Mhm.
it's a cold sledgehammer of a reminder that this was going on for a decade and a half or a decade before the war.
Yep, a decade.
So how many scenes like that were played out across the Mason-Dixon line, even into Pennsylvania, even into Ohio, and those types of places. So really fascinating stuff.
I do think too that some of these flashbacks, I'm somebody that tends to be opposed to flashbacks, especially when they're not well explained, which some of these are not. But I will say that with this series, as the flashbacks are doing a decent job of creating a web of events that tie this story together. And we're going to see that increasingly as the show goes on. That these flashbacks are tying together how this whole story and how all of these characters are interwoven, um, and how that story is interwoven with the uh, Amer- wider American story as well, with the coming of the Civil War, the conflict, and then ultimately as the conflict heads towards its end in April 1865, and the events leading up to and immediately following the Lincoln assassination. So I think that those flashbacks are doing some good service, even though I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of flashbacks in general. Um, Lots of conspiracy theories being bat around within the War Department, about whether Johnson's involved, about Confederate Secret Service, Confederate government, Jefferson Davis being involved in this assassination plot. Out of these scenes with Stanton in the first two episodes, I have to say, for an actor who played villains like Jack Randall in Outlander, who is voted as one of the worst villains in all of television history. He's not playing Stanton as gruff or as grumpy, as much as I would imagine Stanton was in the days after the assassination. It's kind of stuck out to me that he just seems like he's like a little too agreeable, and
You
just
need
a
to
little
be,
too
yeah,
nice.
yeah, be more frustrated, be more
Yeah.
grumpy. That's a good way to put it.
We get the return of Stanton as crime scene investigator. We also get to see him start to be an interrogator as well. We see him talking to Weichman, who's the War Department fellow that reminds Justin of Tyler Reddick, who lives in the Surratt household. And he has the line, didn't we all make friends before the war, about talking about like how the conflict has divided friendships and families. I think that line there serves for that purpose. um, we do get more experiences, more flashbacks with Mary being taken from Pennsylvania back to slavery in Maryland at the Mudd household. That brings her back to the house to show that she experienced freedom before the outbreak of the Civil War, so she knows what that is like. She knows what emancipation can mean, even though in the months after emancipation in Maryland, she has not yet gotten that for herself and for other members of the household of the Mudd household. We also see the realization that Booth is in the photograph of Lincoln's second inauguration, his speech. This is a photograph. You can go and see it in the Library of Congress collection. You can blow it up, and there, clear as day, is John Wilkes Booth overlooking the speech that Abraham Lincoln is giving. And we get lots of conversation here about the policies of Reconstruction, references to it in the second inaugural address. There's a quote that stuck out to me here. It's name the truth about this fight, about what the Civil War was about what the conflict meant, and what it means for the end of slavery in America, bringing emancipation and Reconstruction to the country. And we see Andrew Johnson as the opposite of this, someone who is not interested in Reconstruction. And this debate, well, not so much a debate as much as it's just two men talking past each other. This is a relationship between the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and the new president, Andrew Johnson, that is ultimately going to end in the first impeachment of a president in American history.
And then I think also too, well, you talk about the policies that you see Lincoln and you see Stanton talk about. That relationship between Stanton and Johnson will also be the failure of a lot of those policies and the failure, quote unquote, of Reconstruction after the war, for these freed men and women who are throughout the South and throughout the country.
Yep. And so we continue flying along to the end of this story. We finally hear a reference to the end of slavery in Maryland. That did take place in November of 1864, so a couple months before this story takes place. A little bit of a difference in the story here. We see Surratt at the Mudd boarding house. Surratt, as soon as he learns of the assassination, is like out of there. He's heading for Canada, gets out of the country, and we'll pick up that trail a little bit later on. But I did think this was kind of a weird, um, having him kind of dawdling around after the assassination. Whereas he basically he's running out of the country as fast as he can, gets to Canada. And then we have the funeral train concept. This is kind of going through kind of a theme running through this episode is the development of the funeral train concept that is going to carry Lincoln, his remains, and his family from Washington, D.C. on a really circuitous route around the country, multiple funerals in multiple capitals across the northern states, ultimately making a way towards the burial, ultimately in Lincoln's adopted hometown of Springfield, Illinois. And that is where we leave episode two, where our synopsis ends for this show. And now we're going to jump into some additional opinions on these first two episodes. I'm going to throw it over to Justin. What did you think of these first two episodes of Manhunt?
I mean, I have fun watching it, and I think that's the barometer for me to enjoy things. The history, there are some scenes that get laughably wrong, which we'll talk about. There's a USCT unit that's going to be charging through the debris and the ruins of Richmond here in the next couple scenes that we're going to laugh at, because it's just absurd. But they also do some things that they get very right. We've talked about all the different scenes we like: the assassination, the fugitive slave act, seeing that in there. So I think that it's a good, I don't know, maybe it's because my expectations were so low. And Jake and I talked about this with Masters of the Air when we did it on our Jake's Facebook page, is that it's the expectations for that were very high, and it was a fantastic show. But then there were still times that we were like, well, I don't really enjoy it. Whereas this one, I think because my expectations were so low, I was like, hey, whatever goes, man. I'll as long as I'm being entertained, that's fine, because I know that my expectations just weren't there. And I think Jake talked about this too. The scene with Mary was something that I think was needed. It was hard to watch with John Wilkes Booth, and what I mean by that is that that there's a very easy way to do this story and make Booth as a sympathetic figure, right? To kind of feel for him and say, okay, oh, almost in a sad way, rooting for him. And I think those scenes are a good reminder of the monster that he is in the inside, and the act that he did, set in the country back, how many years. It's hard to watch. The scenes are hard to watch, but they're necessary and they are needed, because I think that the actor who plays Booth, he did a great job with Harry Crosby. He's doing a really good job here, and I wanted to make sure that they threw that in there. That way, we're not, our view of Booth isn't changed after this to be like, oh, he wasn't so bad, or oh, I kind of felt for him and this and that. No, this is a awful person, and I think that you just need to kind of remind yourself of that and the different things that he believes and the words that he uses to describe people, which they don't pull any punches here. They're using those same exact words that were used back then. So yeah, first two episodes down, I'm having fun. I enjoy it. I think that going into it with those expectations kind of helped this series, in a way, in my mind. But that's my opinion. Jake, what about you? How about you thought the first couple episodes?
Yeah, I agree on kind of low expectations coming into this. And from there, I have been enjoying it. I've been describing this as kind of like a similar experience to, like, it's nowhere near as good as this, but a similar experience with like National Treasure, um, where it's a film where the history is bunk, but it's a great movie. And this is not quite that good, but the history is sometimes pretty suspect, but it's a decent show. It as a television product, it's pretty good. The storylines are making sense. They're really kind of playing up that little bit of mystery, a little bit of conspiracy. Um, so I've come away not being as disappointed as I thought I was going to be. I thought when we were deciding to do this podcast about Manhunt that I was going to be watching these episodes and we were just going to rip it, and everyone would be like, "Wow, why did you even review these? You hate
Right.
them so much." Um,
Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer, right? Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah. That was the
exactly.
expectation.
Yeah. So I came away, pretty pleasantly surprised at that. But another thing I've been thinking about a lot, kind of two things with this is one, this is a a miniseries that is very much in conversation with the 2012 film Lincoln. It's in the same time period. It's talking about a lot of the same things, and I think in the same way that when we look at like books and kind of historiography, ways that different authors kind of interpret different historical figures in different time periods or the same time period. They may have different interpretations of that. This show and Lincoln kind of are having a similar conversation. And I'll get to this in just a little bit, but I think some of those conversation pieces are really interesting and tell us a little bit about how different Civil War history and how we remember the Civil War has changed in the last 12 years since the movie Lincoln came out. But I really like the way that this show centers the political fight over Reconstruction, emancipation, and the end of the Civil War as central to this plot and ultimately to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, because that is the truth of the matter. When you look at Booth, when you look at what he said in the days leading up to the assassination, what he wrote in the days leading up, and then what he wrote subsequently, um, and in his conversations as well, you see the reality of what he was fighting for. And he was fighting for many of the same things that the Confederacy was fighting for continued slavery, for Southern institutions, i.e., slavery and white supremacy staying the same. And ultimately, that he viewed Lincoln as a dictator, as an evil person because he was ending those institutions in the South. He was bringing emancipation. He was arming Black men in the United States Army, and sending them into the South and destroying the Southern way of life as Booth idea like kind of what's the term idolizes it is what I'm I think the word for it. And so
Yeah, we'll go with that.
yeah, so he puts it up on this pedestal again because he's making it central to his identity. So the fact that Lincoln is taking that away makes him out to be this evil villain in John Wilkes Booth's mind. I really think that this is a really they've done a good job of centering this because this is where the interpretation at places like Ford's Theater, this is what has changed in the last decade. These conversations talking, not sugarcoating what John Wilkes Booth was about, what his ideas were, why he did what he did, telling the story like it is, even though that is a really hard truth and a bitter pill for a lot of people to swallow. This is the reality of why he did what he did, and ultimately that he was an avowed white supremacist and a Confederate sympathizer and believed that he was acting in the best interests of the South and of the Confederacy in its final death throes. Um, so I will get myself off of my soapbox now, um, and throw it over to you, throw it back to you, Justin, to talk a little bit about some more of the history kind of behind the series.
Yeah, and I think that Jake and I have talked about it, or we discussed it a little bit that we were going to tease it, but there's a great so in grad school, you read a lot of books, and there's a lot of things you read. And one of the books that stuck out the most to me was a book called After Appomattox, and it was a book that detailed kind of the military situation in the South after the war. And the argument of the author is that the failure of Reconstruction is in a way tied to the drawdown of the U.S. Army at the time where the U.S. Army needs to grow and expand because it is the law in the South. The emancipation is great, Reconstruction is great, but if there's not a Union soldier, if there's not a United States soldier down there, then what's the point? In a lot of these rural areas, you start to see this terrific, not terrific in a good way, but terrific, horrifying clan violence of ex Confederates. It's because the United States Army cannot reach to protect the people out there. So in that book, he talks about how there's a Appomattox, and I'm going to use the term myth. I don't know if that's the correct word, but for this conversation, I'm going to say it. There's a myth that once Robert E. Lee surrenders, all of the killing stopped, and that's not going to be the case. The war will continue. Jake already mentioned it. It'll just shift to a new phase. There's still tremendous violence throughout the entire country. There are people dying every single day in the South, both with disease, but also violence, and freed men and women throughout the South who are killed throughout Reconstruction um, in a way that I think sometimes by saying, "Oh, yep, the Civil War is over in April of 1865," you lose sight of the fact that no, there's still a lot of fighting and there's still a lot of picking up the pieces of the actual military conflict of the war and putting them back together. And I think that's where you see the post-war years not reflected in a lot of things about the Civil War and a lot of places that we talk about the Civil War. Gregory Downs is the author of the book. He talked about how the National Park Service is, at the time he said this, and I don't know the year that it was printed, but the National Park Service was somewhat culpable in this belief that the Civil War ends at Appomattox. If you go to places like Gettysburg or Antietam or Fredericksburg or even Appomattox itself, it talks about that moment in April as being the seminal end of the war, ignoring the fact that there are other Confederate armies in the field still fighting. It's just the surrender of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia that ends, quote unquote, the war in Appomattox. So um, I don't know. It's just one thing I think this show surprisingly, and I didn't even think that they were going to address it, but they talk about this. You see the violence continue throughout the country, or at least with Lincoln's assassination, you could say that that is the violence stems from the war still too. I'm interested to see where they go for it with Mary, with the freedwoman and her experiences. You kind of see her start, picking up the pieces of what her life means now that she is free, and how her interactions with Dr. Mudd change and what she can think and what she can say. So I don't know. It's interesting, and I think that that was an unintended. I don't know if the producers intended me to think about it, but that's one thing I was thinking about as I'm watching the series. I was like, wow, okay, this is good because it shows the war is not over for Stanton. Also, I mean, if you ask Stanton this, I think he would agree with or say flat out, once this occurs, no, the war shifts to a new phase. And I think that that's kind of an interesting thing to think about when you talk about the Civil War is prolonging the quote unquote end of it. But that was just one thing I saw. Jake, what about you? I know there's some different things we've kind of you see in regards to Reconstruction and in post-war kind of history that you don't often see in certain public history places.
Yeah, yeah. I've kind of made allusion to some of these things. I think I'll focus this on one thing that really jumped out to me as I was thinking about these first two episodes, and thinking about the show in general. Is just because of the emphasis on emancipation, Reconstruction, centering that in the story, the messy, violent politics as the Confederacy is dying. Um, I've really been thinking about the portrayal of Lincoln in the 2012 film from Steven Spielberg, and with Daniel Day Lewis doing an amazing job playing Abraham Lincoln, um, and just how different the interpretations of the same time period are. Where we see in the 2012 film Lincoln, we see Lincoln's death is kind of ultimately it's kind of the end of the film. We see there is a conversation about Reconstruction that's taking place. The film, of course, centers around the raucous battle about getting the passage of the 13th Amendment um, in the House of Representatives just a couple of months before the events of April 1865. But the thing that we don't see in that film, and I didn't really realize it until just how front and center this narrative is in Manhunt, is we don't see the direct tie in that film between Reconstruction and emancipation and the end of slavery and Lincoln's death. They are removed from each other. Lincoln's death and this kind of surprised me at the time, is not directly addressed in the film, other than that we see him going to the theater and then we flash to his son at a different theater, and the news is being spread, and then we see the aftermath of the assassination, and then ultimately go into the second inaugural address and hear that, even though that was about a month earlier, in which he talks about the Civil War. He talks about the end of the war, what the war was about, but there's no direct tie. In part because we don't see John Wilkes Booth, um, and we don't understand his motivations. We don't; those are not even brought up in the film at all. And in this series, in Manhunt, because we see John Wilkes Booth, because we are being immersed in his hatred and his white supremacy and his love for the slaveholding South, we see the realities, and each episode builds on this. We see the realities of what made him do what he did, and what is making, and he ends up becoming kind of the proxy for white Southerners that are going to pick up weapons, are going to continue the violence that Booth shows for the first time, this asymmetric terrorist, as we would refer to it today, terrorist violence, um, that they are going to, as the field armies of the Confederacy are surrendering, we see this violence appear more and more. And Booth is the first to really do it in the post Appomattox environment. And he does it on a global stage, assassinating the president of the United States because of his racist, white supremacist, pro Confederate views. Um, and this is going to give, in some ways, you could say that this gives license to thousands of Southerners, of white Southerners across the South, to, over the subsequent 15 years, and then into the decades that follow, continue to use these forms of violence against those in the South who support emancipationist Reconstruction policies, but especially against freed people in the South as well. And I think this show is doing a really good job. Again, like you said, Justin, not sure how intentional this is, or if maybe we're doing a little bit reading, maybe I'm doing a little bit reading too much into this. But by centering this story of Booth's motivations and what drove him, it's really getting into and tapping into um, just how violent this period post Appomattox is going to become. And this is really a kind of a bellwether of where the fight over Reconstruction is going to be. It's going to be violent. There's
Oh
going to be
yeah.
assassinations, and not just in the South as well. I think of Octavius Cato in Philadelphia, a Black rights activist who was assassinated in the early 1870s in Philadelphia as well. So this is, we're entering a different era of American politics, and one in which violence is going to play a key role in the aftermath of our bloody Civil War. And I think this show is beginning to, is doing a good job of portraying this on film and showing this for the first time, that I can think of in a series that really is diving into telling this aspect of the story, which is where we as public historians have really gone since the end of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, because of, in some cases, events taking place in our own time, having giving us a different understanding of the events of the past, and being able to see suddenly, well, no, this is really important. We need to talk about Booth's motivations. We need to talk about what's motivating white Southerners to do the violent acts they're performing in the aftermath of the Civil War.
Well, I think we covered it all, Jake.
I think so. I think so. Um, do we have any final thoughts there, Justin? Before we
I I would just say this: the show's got me. I'm along for the fun. And maybe it's because I'm a historian wise, Civil War wise. I'm more of a military guy. I don't know more of the inner workings of the political and social kind of stuff that comes, especially Reconstruction. There, I very very bad on Reconstruction, which is a shame. Um, but yeah, I'm along for the fun. I am excited. Maybe it's because I don't know. I mean, the only book that I've read specifically about Lincoln's assassination has been Manhunt. So maybe it's because I don't really have that rooted in like a you know fact checked kind of good history. I read this book and I remember it being good. So yeah, that's about all I have. I think I'm looking forward to continue watching the series in that lens. But yeah, how about you, Jake?
Oh, I've said probably enough. So we'll move into our final segment. This is one I'm really excited. We're both excited to be able to share with you, and we'll do this with our guests as well. We have guest interview session episodes in the future. It is time for what we're calling the postscript. This is a
Postscript.
segment of our show where we share something from the last week that's left an impression on us that we want to share. It could be a book, an article, a movie, or an experience, something that we want to remember from our last week. It could be good, could be bad, could be worse. So, Justin, what's your postscript this week?
Yeah, so it's funny enough, just thinking outside the box. It is a YouTube video. If anybody's listening to this, I would tell you do yourself a favor and subscribe to a man. His name's Destin Sandlin. Runs a YouTube page called Smarter Every Day. It is the best described YouTube page that I think I've ever seen, because by watching it, you will become just a little bit smarter each day. And he is an engineer, YouTuber. He's getting his PhD, and he is offered a talk at the 2023 Von Braun Space Exploration Symposium. And the talk, as he describes it, is to a group of people who are helping NASA get back to the moon, running what's called the Artemis program, which is our return to the moon. And basically, it's half pep talk, half speaking truth to issues, and issues I think you can take to any workplace throughout the country. His big 3 points are: look at the mission differently. In a world of talkers, be a doer and ask the hard questions. And lastly, focus on the mission. Don't forget what at the heart of what you're trying to do, and keeping it simple. He brings up primary source documents. So, in a way, I guess he is somewhat of a historian. He brings up a document called NASA SP-287. You can Google it. You do not need to pay for it. It's called What Made Apollo a Success. And it is the NASA engineers, after the success of the Apollo program, sitting down, coming together and said, okay, what did we do right? How did we do it right? And what do we want to tell future generations about it? And I think that his connection to NASA history, in that sense of making that direct line of, this is the playbook they were giving the next group of engineers to get back to the moon. During the talk, he references a former, does kind of an oral history with a NASA engineer. I don't know. He's an engineer. Destin's an engineer kind of science guy. So I don't know. He was realizing he was doing an oral history, but he was doing one. And he asked the NASA engineer, do you think engineers were smarter during your age or than now? And the engineer flatly just says, no, I don't. You guys are if not smarter than us, because you have us to look back on. And I think he's speaking Destin, um, wanted to make sure that was said in a room with a bunch of people who are going to make very important decisions for NASA in the next couple of years to get us back to the moon. So it's a fantastic talk. I would just love, highly recommend his YouTube channel enough. Subscribe to it also, because it's about once every 2 to 3 months he gets a video in there. It's usually a 20, 30-minute video, and you will become smarter every single day you kind of view his stuff. So that's my postscript. That's what I enjoyed kind of watching this week. Jake, how about you?
Yeah, so mine's going to be a book that I just finished up this last week. It's called The Takeover by Timothy Rybeck. This documents the last 6 months before Adolf Hitler gets appointed to become Chancellor of Germany. It's kind of the final death knell of the Weimar Republic. This is a topic very, very interested in the Second World War, and the coming of that conflict. This is one of the most compelling books that I've ever read on the subject. In part because it goes into super granular detail about the events that shaped late 1932 and early 1933 and the ascension of Hitler. Um, I found just so fascinating when you get to the level of detail that we think we may know a lot about these kind of massively important world events. But the more you kind of dive into the details, the more you realize that things are a lot fuzzier and blurrier, and there are very small events can have really tremendously large impacts that don't always come down the ages to us through kind of these bigger biographies or histories that tell a bigger story. It's really when you get into these kind of looking at these kind of micro histories, looking at individual moments much more closely, that you see the way that these smaller events and individuals can have an impact on history that doesn't necessarily get brought into the larger narrative when you see like a full biography length book or something that looks at the wider time period. And I found that it really encouraged kind of a lot of empathy, especially with the people who were opposed to the Nazis, and understanding their motivations and why they acted the way they did in ways that ultimately may not have helped the situation, but they thought they were doing the right thing at the time, and in part because they don't know the outcome. And this is a book that reminds me, and I love books that do this, that remind me that the people who lived through these events didn't know what the end is going to look like. And in this case, the end came quite violently to a lot of the characters in this book, but they didn't know that was the end of their story. And what this book did a really great job of, really well done storytelling, is really trying to get you to live through that moment in history as it was happening to better understand what was taking place and ultimately how he came to power. And ultimately is going to shape and reshape the course of human history, for sure. One of the best books that I've read in a while. So both of these, Justin's video and my book that I referenced, we'll drop the links to those into the show notes so that you can find those. You can check them out yourself.
So with that, first one down, Jake. I think, yeah, this is a big moment. But anyway, first episode of Public History with Jake and Justin. We thank you guys for listening this far. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope we are excited to continue doing this. Jake and I have a blast. It's genuine fun, and I hope that reflects into you guys listening to us too. So if you enjoyed it, give us a rating, review, subscribe, do all that stuff to kind of help us out, grow the platform, and be able to continue talking about things like this. So until next time, goodbye.
See ya.